I want to start this one differently. No intro, no welcome back to MetaTherapy, because the people I'm making this episode for, they're already tired. And the last thing they need is for me to be burning 2 minutes on housekeeping before I get into the thing I actually mean. So let me just start. If you are autistic or if you've recently been told that you are, I want you to think about what yesterday cost you, not the big stuff, the small stuff. The meeting where you tracked 17 different facial expressions while simultaneously processing what someone was saying. The lunch where you had to decide in real time whether to laugh at something that didn't land as funny to you, because not laughing would require an explanation you didn't have the energy to give. The drive home where you sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before you needed silence, before you could go inside. That's not laziness and that's not weakness. That is the work of performing neurotypical in a world that expects it from you every single day. And if you are a parent, a caregiver to someone with significant ongoing needs, I want you to think about the last time you did something just for you, not to recover so you could give more, not to check a self-care box, but just for you. Take a second. If you can't remember, that's what this episode is all about. Today is a special episode. It's April, Autism Acceptance Month. And instead of making the kind of content you'll find everywhere else this month, I want to hold two experiences at the same time. The autistic person navigating a world that wasn't built for them, and the caregiver who loves them and who is also quietly disappearing. Both of those people deserve to be seen today, and that's what we're going to do. April is Autism Awareness Month, or more accurately, as I said, Autism Acceptance Month. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. Awareness says autism exists. Here are some facts. Acceptance says autistic people exist. Here's how we can actually include them. This year, the Autism Society of America chose the theme Celebrate Differences. And the United Nations went with Autism and Humanity. Every life has value. Two different organizations, two different scopes, and both of them pushing in the same direction, away from pity, away from tragedy narratives, and towards something that actually looks like respect. Now, I'll be honest with you. I think Celebrate Differences is a harder ask than it sounds. Tolerating differences is relatively easy. Accommodating them on a good day is manageable, but celebrating them requires a different posture entirely. It requires looking at the way someone experiences the world differently from you and deciding that difference adds something, not despite how hard it can be, but alongside it. And that's what I want to build toward today. Globally, 1 in 127 people is diagnosed with autism. Diagnoses have increased over 300% since 2000, driven almost entirely by improved diagnostic criteria and greater awareness, not an actual rise in prevalence. Millions of adults are currently living undiagnosed. And that last part, the undiagnosed millions, is where this episode really begins. So there's a concept in the autism research world called masking. I'm sure many of you have heard of that term, or sometimes it's also referred to as camouflaging. And if you're autistic and you're watching this, you probably already know exactly what I'm talking about because you've been doing it your whole life. Masking is what happens when you suppress who you are to survive in a space that wasn't built for you. Not, it can be conscious. You decide not to stim in a meeting because you've learned people find it uncomfortable. You rehearse conversations before you have them. You force eye contact even though it costs you concentration because you've learned that looking away reads as rudeness. Or it can be unconscious, so automatic, so deeply worn in that you don't even experience it as masking anymore. You just experience it as exhaustion, anxiety, a vague, persistent sense that something about being in the world is harder for you than it seems to be for everyone else, and not knowing why. And here's the clinical piece that I don't think gets said loudly enough. The better someone masks, the more invisible their needs become, which means the more likely they are to be missed, misdiagnosed, treated for anxiety or depression for years, sometimes decades, while the actual source of that anxiety and depression goes completely unnamed. Research published in 2025 found that high levels of masking are consistently associated with higher depression, higher anxiety, lower self esteem, and a reduced sense of personal authenticity. And when clinicians treat these symptoms without identifying the underlying neurodevelopmental profile, they address the smoke while the fire keeps burning. I've seen this not once, many times. And I want to be direct about something. Our field has not been good enough at this, particularly with adults, particularly with women, particularly with people of color who face additional barriers to diagnosis that compound everything that I just described. We still have a very long way to go. 2025 study of 130 autistic adults found that roughly half of standard therapy adaptations were rated as helpful, meaning the other half simply don't land. When anxiety or depression is treated without identifying the underlying neurodevelopmental profile, the clinical response is necessarily incomplete. There's also something called autistic burnout, and I want to distinguish that from burnout you hear about with everyone else right now. Autistic burnout isn't just being tired from work. It's a specific type of collapse, mental, physical, and emotional, that happens when the cumulative cost of navigating a neurotypical world finally exceeds what a person can carry. It can look like a sudden loss of skills, withdrawal, profound exhaustion that doesn't respond to rest. Many of the interventions we use for standard burnout doesn't work on autistic burnout because they're designed for a different nervous system. And the honest caveat I have to name here, because I always want to be straight with you, is that unmasking is not a simple solution. The world still penalizes visible autism. There are real risks to being fully yourself in environments that weren't designed for you. This isn't just a personal challenge, it's a structural one. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What I can tell you is this: when the right support finds the right person, when someone finally gets to say, this is what my brain does, and that's not a character flaw, something shifts. And that shift matters. I want to stop here because everything I just described, that weight, that invisible cost, it doesn't only live inside the autistic person. It lives in the people who love them too. A writer named Crystal Anderson put it into words better than I have ever heard in a therapy room. And I've been sitting with this piece for a couple of days, and I want to share it with you today. She writes, one of the hardest parts of being a special needs parent isn't the appointments, the therapies, or even the constant advocating. It's the profound and prolonged loss of autonomy. Because when you become a parent, you expect to lose some of that. You expect the newborn phase to consume you. You expect sleepless nights, constant touch, always being needed. And you hold on to the quiet promise that eventually, little by little, you'll get pieces of yourself back. But when your child has significant or ongoing needs, that phase doesn't end. That same level of dependence, the one people tell you is temporary, becomes your baseline, your normal, your forever, and it touches everything. Your time is no longer your own. Your body is not fully yours. Your plans are always tentative. Your energy is rationed carefully because it has to be. Spontaneity disappears. Rest looks different. Even your identity shifts because you're constantly adjusting around what your child needs to survive, to function, to thrive. And here's the part people don't always say out loud. You can love your child with everything you have and still grieve the autonomy you lost. Both things can exist at the same time. This life asks more of you than most people will ever understand, not just in moments, but across years, across decades. So if you're feeling that weight, the invisible, ongoing surrender of self, just know you're not alone in it, and it's okay to name it. What Crystal describes here in a very beautiful way has a clinical name: parental burnout. And research consistently shows that parents of children with significant or ongoing needs experience it at substantially higher rates than any other parent. But I want to be careful here because parental burnout can sound like a diagnostic or a diagnosis of failure. Like you burned out because you didn't manage yourself well enough. That is not what the research says. What the research says is that the single greatest protective factor against parental burnout is social support, not self care, not mindset, not better time management, support, community, people who actually show up. And the tragedy is that special needs caregivers are often the most isolated people in the room because the demands of the life don't leave a lot of room for the kinds of relationships that make support possible. There's a particular grief that lives inside this experience that I want to name because I think it's the part that gets the least airtime. It's the grief of the life you thought you were going to have. When you become a parent, you carry a picture in your mind of what it will look like, milestones, conversations, shared experiences. And when your child's needs require you to release that picture, to grieve the typical and build something entirely different, that grief is real. It deserves to be named, not because it defines your relationship with your child, but because carrying unnamed grief is exhausting in a way that compounds everything else. Parents of children with special needs report significantly higher parental burnout and caregiver burden compared to parents of neurotypical children. About 50% of this variance is explained by the interaction of risk and protective factors, chief among them, social support. I want to tell you about my cousin Scott and his son, Andrew. Andrew was diagnosed with autism at 18 months old, and Scott told me something I've been thinking about ever since. He said, when the diagnosis came, it felt like Andrew had been given a terminal disease. That's the moment I'm asking you to sit with for a second, because that's not an unusual response. That's grief, immediate, disorienting, real grief, arriving at the exact moment a parent is supposed to be receiving a roadmap. Scott went down a rabbit hole, his words. He's fought his way out of it. He studied, he researched, he found people in the same boat. And then something shifted. Andrew is nonverbal. He doesn't say, I love you. But Scott told me he sees it in the way Andrew looks at him. Andrew is nonverbal, but he speaks volumes. He may not say, I love you, but I see it in the way he looks at me. Having autism doesn't mean he doesn't understand either. When our Mim was at Clifton, which is a nursing home that she was being treated at before her death, he was dragging us out after a few minutes. My cousin said that he was dragging us out after a few minutes. And when he realized that Mim had started to decline, he was there every day after school and sat there and never once complained or tried to leave. He was also the same one to get kisses from Mim right to the end. He knew Mim was sick and he knew her time was coming up. And that is what was amazing. I've heard a lot of things over the years as a therapist, and that one stops me. A nonverbal 20-year-old sitting vigil at his grandmother's bedside every day after school, not because anyone told him to, but because he understood, because he felt it, because love, it turns out, does not require words. Scott also told me something about the early days that I think every new special needs parent needs to hear. He said he felt cheated, that he was being robbed of the typical experience he had imagined having as a father. And then he said that was completely wrong. I wasn't cheated. I was blessed. Because Andrew still loved the things Scott loved. Classic cars, speed, long rides by the water. They just found their own version of it. In fact, just last weekend on Andrew's 20th birthday, they drove 260 miles together. Miles of smiles. That's what Scott called it. It's not a consolation prize. That's a life. I share that not to suggest that every caregiver's story ends in that kind of clarity. Some days are just hard. Some seasons just survival. And the grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. But Scott's story holds something important for the caregivers watching this. You are not alone. There are more resources, more communities, more people in the same boat than there have been ever before. The diagnosis is not a life sentence, and the life you build, even when it looks nothing like what you had planned, can still be very full. It will just be yours. I've been talking about two different people today, the autistic person and the caregiver. Both of them are carrying weight that most of the world can't see. The autistic person is exhausted from performing neurotypical, from constantly translating themselves for a world that never had to translate for them. The caregiver is exhausted from holding everything together, from the invisible labor of coordinating, advocating, adjusting, and absorbing year after year without a finish line in sight. And both of them, more often than not, have been told implicitly or explicitly that what they're feeling is an overreaction. There's also something I want to name about communication between these two people when they're in the same household. Research has found something called the double empathy problem. The idea that the communication breaks down between autistic and non-autistic people aren't a deficit in one person. They're just a mismatch, two different processing styles encountering each other with a shared translator, which means the autistic person isn't failing to connect and the caregiver isn't failing to understand. Both of them are trying. Both of them are doing it without the right tools, and both of them deserve support that's actually designed for who they are. When both people are seen, really seen, something becomes possible that wasn't before. So let me close with a practical piece, because this is a therapy channel. And if I don't give you something to walk away with, I haven't done my job. If you're autistic or you're wondering whether you might be, look for a neurodiversity affirming therapist, not just a therapist who's willing to work with autistic clients, someone who understands that the goal is not to make you more neurotypical. The goal is to help you understand yourself and build a life that actually is designed for your nervous system, not someone else's. If you received a late diagnosis, the grief is legitimate. The relief is legitimate. The anger at all the years you spent being treated for the smoke without anyone finding the fire, that's legitimate too. All of it can be true at the same time. And if you're a caregiver, the number one thing the research points to is support, not self-care in the bubble bath sense. Actual support, people, community, someone to sit with you in it. Therapy isn't a luxury for caregivers. It's maintenance for the person who's holding everything together. And if you're sitting with the grief that Crystal wrote about, the invisible, ongoing surrender of self, I want you to know that naming it is not a betrayal of your child. It is an act of honesty. And honesty is where healing starts. Scott said something to me when we talked that I keep coming back to. He said that he went straight down the rabbit hole when Andrew was diagnosed. And then he said, I fought like hell to get myself out of it. That's not a small thing. That's someone deciding consciously in the middle of grief and fear and a diagnosis that felt like a door slamming shut that he was going to find a way through. And he did, not by pretending it was easy, not by skipping hard parts, by fighting, by researching, by finding people who understood, and eventually by driving 260 miles with his son on his 20th birthday, windows down, because they both love speed and water and the open road. And that's what I want for you, whatever the version of that looks like in your life. This month is called Autism Acceptance Month. I think the most radical act of acceptance we can offer, whether we're autistic, whether we're a caregiver, whether we're a clinician, is to stop pretending the weight isn't there. Name it. That's where it starts. I'm Dominic, and this has been MetaTherapy. I'll see you next week.